The Osborne family came to Tiruvannamalai to the Ramana ashram in the early 1940s. This is the first recollection from Lucia Osborne. This was from an interview in New Lives by Malcolm Tillis from 1981. Lucia Osborne was the wife of the late Arthur Osborne, who was Ramana's early biographer and editor. She lived at Ramana Ashram for almost 40 years. She was one of the last living Western disciples who knew Ramana in the flesh. You see, my husband was teaching in the University of Bangkok at that time. I was very interested in sculpture. I was involved in a sort of self-inquiry. It wasn't who am I, but who are you? Someone sent us a booklet on Bhagavan with a picture. I saw the face and thought, that's the most fascinating face I've ever seen. The most living and at the same time the most serene. It would make a marvelous subject for a sculpture. That was my first idea. I had been trying to find out who I am since childhood, wondering, asking, judging. In the beginning of 1942, our friends arranged for us to stay in Kashmir to avoid the hot season, although my husband wanted to come straight to the ashram. Since the time he was a schoolboy, he was interested in spirituality. It was he who brought me to it. After a few months, the British High Commissioner said women and children shouldn't go back to Thailand, Siam, as it was called then, as the war was getting serious. My husband went back to his post, and we were offered a house here at the Ramana Ashram. I was then able to meet Bhagavan. I had some preconceived ideas, but when I saw him, everything fell away. His eyes were transparent, looking through you. When you sat with him, there was a feeling of oneness. Everything is one, is one, is one. I spoke with him. I used to show him my letters. My children were the first Western children who came here. They were made a tremendous fuss of. Since that meeting, all my interest in sculpture fell away, no longer important. So that's how it started. I was 38. I have spent exactly half my life here. Now, although I had no news from my husband for 4 years, not one letter, nothing mattered. I sent my 3-year-old son Adam to Bhagavan. He said, Bhagavan, please bring my daddy back safely. From that moment, I didn't worry. In the early days with Bhagavan, we all ask ourselves why we are here. What's the purpose of life? I found from the beginning you get all the answers here. In fact, you don't have to ask any questions. By sitting in Bhagavan's presence, everything is resolved. When I came, I knew the most important thing is to find out who you really are. Those who are sincere get glimpses of that state, and they know. From that, the striving to make the experience steady starts. In Bhagavan's presence, the silence was so powerful, it was the most potent teaching. Words, he used to say, are diffused silence. So bathe in that silence you are. All your cares were thrown among the lilies, to use a beautiful expression. That was sadhana, the spiritual practice. You know, after he passed away, people thought he would become desolate. Nothing of the sort. To my surprise, I was walking on air. There was a feeling of elation. Do you know why? Suddenly you realized he is the inner guru dwelling in the heart, ever present. He had said, I am not going anywhere. Where can I go? Since then, you can feel his presence more than ever. That's why people come here more and more. They experience that radiation. And you only have to tell him something in the heart to get help, no matter what it is. Bhagavan did perform miracles, but they were done in an unobtrusive way. You hardly recognize them as miracles. A child was dying. The doctors had given up hope. The parents sent Bhagavan a telegram. From the moment it arrived, that child started getting better. The parents came to thank Bhagavan. He said, what happened? They insisted he had saved the child. He then explained, if the attention of a yoni is turned in a certain direction, divine activity starts. That I heard him say in English. Help and grace came spontaneously. He didn't have to show anything. A man's wife died. In India, we have to cremate within 24 hours. It was raining cats and dogs. The poor man came to Bhagavan saying, "What should I do?" Bhagavan looked through the window and replied, "It looks as if it might stop." That was all. It stopped. That was the way he did it. Wild animals would come right up to him. There was no fear because they knew there was nothing but peace in him. Bhagavan's teachings about leaving the physical body at the time of death, well, he said the body is but a garment. We don't die, we never die. We drop the physical body, it turns into earth, a tree grows, that eventually turns into coal or ash. It's a perpetual mobile. Our life here is like a moment in which we prepare our future state. It's very important what we do now. I had to give a speech in Bombay. I told them, "Do you know what your real bank account is? Not what you have, but what you do. That goes with you. Everything else is left behind." It's important how one lives because our last thoughts go with us at the time of this physical death. They determine our future, most definitely. This is also according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead. Death can be a wonderful experience. It's a transition. You can almost say that our life is death, and our death a rebirth. To go into the beyond is our true birth. What is encouraging is that earnest effort never fails. People sometimes say no effort is necessary. You were there already. But we are as we are with all of our inherited tendencies. We should be as we should be. Yes, we are already it, but we have to work hard to know it, experience it. Knowing it intellectually isn't enough. If you want to learn to play the piano or to ski, it requires effort until it becomes effortless. Arthur Osborne, an Oxford-educated Britisher, had a high level of spiritual inclination since his university days. He was the founder-editor of The Mountain Path, the collected works of Ramana Maharshi, and The Path of Self-Knowledge, along with many others. He was born in London. From his childhood, he sought the deeper and higher purpose, the meaning of life. Even as a small child in the playgrounds, he felt worldly living was meaningless. He could not share this feeling with anybody. The words of Jesus Christ were his only support. He who seeks shall find. This made him a seeker after truth all his life. He came to Ramana Maharshi only in 1945 as he was stuck in an internment camp in Bangkok, Thailand during World War II. As Arthur said, my wife entered the hall and sat down about the first visit at Ramana's ashram. Immediately, Bhagavan turned his luminous eyes on her in a gaze so concentrated that there was a vibration she could actually hear. She returned the gaze, losing all sense of time, the mind stilled, feeling like a bird caught by a snake, yet glad to be caught. She wrote to me that all her doubts had vanished. Her objections no longer mattered. She had complete faith. The most beautiful face, she told me, looked commonplace beside him. Even though his features were not good, his eyes had the innocence of a small child, together with an unfathomable wisdom and immense love. She felt Bhagavan's power and guidance constantly. During the years of our separation of the war, most of those years with no news of one another, she did not worry. Although my temperament prone to worrying, when offered a job, she did not accept it. A time to go into the world would come later. This was the time to be with Bhagavan. Bhagavan was very gracious during those years, both to her and the children. They would come and show him their toys and tell their secrets. In general, Bhagavan avoided touching people or being touched by them. But each cool season, when my wife brought the children back from the hills, he touched Frania, the youngest, at some time or other, and once he picked her up and carried her. While communications were still open, I had received a letter from my wife telling me that my eldest daughter, Kitty, and my son Adam had gone to Bhagavan and asked him to bring me back safely, and that he smiled and nodded. From then on, she said that she never doubted that I should come out of the war alive. There was also a letter from Kitty, 7 years old at the time, one of my most moving. "Daddy, you will love Bhagavan," she said. "When he smiles, everybody must be so happy." I had come home safely, and when I finally made it to Ramana ashram, there were huge crowds for the festival, and we were sitting in the courtyard outside the hall. Bhagavan was reclining on his couch, and I was sitting in the front row. He sat up, facing me, and his narrowed eyes pierced into me with an intensity I cannot describe. It was as though they said, "You have been told. Why have you not realized?" And then I felt quietness, a depth of peace, an indescribable lightness and happiness. Thereafter, love for Bhagavan began to grow in my heart, and I felt his power and beauty. Next morning, for the first time, sitting before him in the hall, I tried to follow his teaching by using "Who am I?" inquiry, vichara. I thought it was I who had decided. I did not realize that it was the initiation by look that had vitalized me and changed my attitude of mind. Indeed, I had only heard vaguely of this initiation and paid little heed to what I had heard. Only later did I learn that other devotees also had such an experience, and that with them also it had marked the beginning of the active sadhana, or quest, and Bhagavan's guidance. Then for the first time in my life, I began to understand what the grace and blessings of a guru could mean. My love and devotion to Bhagavan deepened. I went about with a lilt of happiness in my heart, feeling the blessing and mystery of the guru, repeating like a love song that he was the guru, the link between heaven and earth, between God and me, between the formless being and my heart. I became aware of the enormous grace of his presence. Even outwardly, he was gracious to me, smiling when I entered the hall, signaling me to sit where he could watch me in meditation. And then one day a vivid reminder awoke in me, the link with the formless being, but he is the formless being, and I began to understand why devotees address him simply as Bhagavan. So he began to prove in me what he declared in his teaching, that the outer guru seems to awaken the guru in the heart. The constant "who am I" inquiry began to evoke an awareness of the self as Bhagavan, the Lord, outwardly, and also simultaneously of the self within. The specious theory that Bhagavan was not a guru had simply evaporated in the radiance of his grace. Moreover, I now perceive that, far from his teaching not being practical guidance, it was exclusively that. I observed that he shunned theoretical explanations and kept turning the questioner to practical considerations of sadhana, of the path to be followed. It was that and only that he was here to teach. Bhagavan was the most simple, natural, unassuming of men. He was what a man should be, quite without affection, like a child, and at the same time with an indescribable beauty and wisdom, and with such power that many trembled in his presence and feared to speak to him. To address him in the third person as Bhagavan seemed appropriate than saying "you" to one who was leading us beyond the duality of you and I. In simple daily affairs, he would play the part of an individual, just as an actor could play Lear's frenzy without himself being frenzied, without supposing he was Lear. Unfortunately, few in the West understand the possibility of this supreme state. There was an air of modesty, of utter simplicity, a childlike defensiveness in Bhagavan. The mere sight of him walking across the ashram ground was enough to grip the heart. His manner of life was the most normal. The love that shone in his eyes, the luminous understanding, cannot be described. Someone came to the ashram and broke down with the hopeless grief of bereavement, and Bhagavan, after hearing the story, simply looked, no word spoken, and peace flooded the soul. He called nothing as this. He called nothing as his. He never asked for anything. He refused to have any special consideration shown to him. He refused to have an electric table fan because the devotees would not benefit equally. Later, ceiling fans were installed and all benefit alike. He never asked anyone to come or told anyone to go. He never pressed any to stay, and yet he watched over each one with the loving solicitude of a mother for her only child. He was affable and courteous to all comers. There was no pontifical solemnity in his expositions. On the contrary, his speech was vivacious. A devotee asked why his prayers were not answered, and Bhagavan replied laughing, "If they were, you might stop praying." Bhagavan Sri Ramana was meticulously exact. His daily life was conducted with the punctiliousness that Indians today would have to call pure Western. In everything he was precise and orderly. The books were always in their places. The loincloth, which was all he wore, was gleaming white. The 2 clocks in the hall were adjusted daily to radio time. The calendar was never allowed to fall behind the date. He was divine grace in human form. While fully human, he was fully in samadhi, fully divine, alike when talking and when sitting silent. He merely responded according to the need of those who approached him. He was all love, and yet for weeks together he might not favor a devotee with a single look or smile. Bhagavan was a Jivan Mukti, emancipated while yet in the physical body. He was indeed the universal divine guru. One who has attained the supreme state is above all forms of religion. There are the paths leading up to the peak, but he is the peak itself and everything else. He came to answer the need of our age, proclaiming a path which, with his grace and support, can be followed by aspirants of any religion, and indeed whether they observed any formal religion or not. Bhagavan's initiation was not freely given and open. It was concealed. Had it been open, the constant stream of visitors from India and abroad would have demanded it, putting Bhagavan under the necessity of accepting one and rejecting another. For ordinarily, many seek initiation without pledging themselves to the quest, merely as a sort of spiritual tonic. If asked, Bhagavan would never deny that he gave initiation, but he would also say that he would never openly affirm it. Being the universal guru, Bhagavan proclaimed his teaching openly. It has been usual for a guru to maintain secrecy about methods of training. Under Bhagavan's guidance, however, understanding and aspiration were the only qualifications, and their absence the only barriers. Man has 3 functions: thought, action, and being. Being underlies the other 2 and is the necessary substratum for them, and yet is almost completely overshadowed by them. The simile Bhagavan made use of was of a cinema screen on which film is shown. The spectators become aware of the picture, which are only shadows on the screen, which is unaffected by them. A fire in the picture does not burn the screen, nor a flood make it wet. Sometimes he gave the example of an actor on a stage playing a certain part, although knowing that he is not really that person. Sometimes of a bank cashier who pays out thousands coolly and efficiently, knowing that it is not his money that he is paying. Near the end of his life, Arthur Osborne was visited by 2 men who came from Delhi to Tiruvannamalai especially to meet him and find out what it was like to be with Ramana. Lucia, his wife, seated them on a veranda while she carried on with her work. About an hour later, hearing no sound from outside, she assumed the men had left and came out. She was startled to see the 3 of them still sitting together in silence. Obviously, they got a sense of what it was like to be with Ramana. Kitty Osborne, who I believe is still alive at the time of this recording in February 2020, believe she lives in Kodaikanal, India still, and she would be about 83 years old. She was 5 years old when her mother, Lucia Osborne, and 2 younger siblings, Adam and Frania, first arrived at the ashram in 1942. She was in her 60s or 70s when she wrote the following account. The first time I saw Bhagavan is as clear today as it was at the time, all those many years ago. It must have been the day after we arrived. My father was not with us, as he had been in a concentration camp in Bangkok where we had lived previously. With us 3 small children clustered around her, my mother went to the ashram for the first time to receive Bhagavan's darshan. As the oldest, I was in charge of a tray of fruit we were bringing. It had been explained to us that the only acceptable gift to Bhagavan was fruit, which could be shared in the dining hall later. The tray I bore, laden with bananas and oranges, felt huge. My arms were stretched around it, and it threatened to wobble free and spill everything onto the ground. It took intense concentration to keep things from collapsing, but it was my responsibility, and I took it seriously. We walked across the open space that was occupied by a few sleeping dogs, some squirrels, and a peacock. Then we entered the cool hall where he sat, known now as the Old Hall, but in those days it was the only hall, and the main entrance was a door opposite the couch. We entered and saw Bhagavan straight away, sitting on the couch in front of us. There he was. Seeing him, all the rest of the room and the people faded away. There was such a presence, and yet it didn't feel strange. He seemed luminous and magical and friendly all at once. I stood there staring at him, not knowing what to do with my burden of fruit. He smiled and pointed to a stool at the side of the couch that was used to receive such offerings. I didn't know that, and since there was no guardrail around him back in those days, I sat myself down on the stool with my back to Bhagavan and smiled happily at all the people in the hall, who were smiling back at me. We were the first European children to come there, and a definite novelty. I was still holding the tray. Bhagavan laughed and made a remark in Tamil, which we didn't yet understand. It was translated to me. He had said that I was making an offering of myself. All the rest of my life, when I've got myself into one sort of mess or another, that remark has given me the courage to go on. After all, Bhagavan must surely help one who has made an offering of herself. Year after year, even during our school days in Kodaikanal, we were going to Tiruvannamalai during holidays. Every holiday I came and Bhagavan was there, just the same as ever, and so we slipped seamlessly into our old lives. The hill and the hall never changed, and as far as a child's eyes could judge, neither did Bhagavan Ramana. We did not notice that his body was getting older. I wish now that I had spent more time sitting in the hall, instead of climbing a tree with my book. Of course, I thought Bhagavan Ramana would be there forever, and of course he is. My memories of arriving in India are fractured and mainly unclear, but my memories of arriving in Tiruvannamalai are surprisingly coherent. It was hot, that I can clearly state, and it was also incredibly dusty. Why the dust should have made such an impression on me, I now find hard to understand, but in my mind's eye there is a soft pall of pale gold dust over everything. It was in the air and on the road. After dark, the dust was cool and welcoming to the feet like puffs of talcum powder. Although the place was new and strange, I never associate a feeling of strangeness with Tiruvannamalai, perhaps because it was such a short time before it became familiar as home. In the way of children, my brother and sister and I rapidly learnt the language and made friends with other children. It cannot have been quite as quick as my memory recalls, because my brother Adam was barely walking when we arrived, and my sister Frania was a babe in arms. Our friends were the gardener's daughter and the children of the ashram, Sundaram, who is now the president, Ganesh and Mani, as well as their sisters. But all that happened later. The years of our childhood were spent running in and out of the hall. Frania learned to walk there, Adam learned to run, and I learned whatever it is one learns when playing at Bhagavan's feet, most of it probably by osmosis. It was there that we saw the animals come to visit him. The peacock would come through the door and right up to the couch. Then the beautiful tail was spread and it would dance. Bhagavan watched, we all watched, as though it was a formal program, and when it was all over, Bhagavan gravely acknowledged the peacock's performance, and it left. The squirrels came to the door and glanced around nervously. Then there was a dash to the couch and up to Bhagavan's hand or knee. He sometimes gave them puffed rice from a small tin kept for the purpose.
Dogs came and prostrated themselves before the couch, and monkeys chattered to him from outside the window. They were frequently chased away, but as frequently reappeared. One time someone showed Bhagavan a paragraph in the newspaper where there was an announcement that vans were touring the villages and collecting monkeys for sale abroad for experiments. Bhagavan laughingly said to the king monkey who was clinging onto the bars of the window beside his couch, "Did you hear that? It isn't safe for monkeys here right now, so you better take your tribe away." When the vans came, there wasn't a monkey in sight, not one in the whole ashram area. Later, I heard someone comment that no monkeys had been caught in the whole town of Tiruvannamalai. Then, of course, there was Lakshmi the cow. She would wait for Bhagavan outside the back door or call him to come, and then she would snuggle up to him and rub her head against him, or else he would go and visit her in the cowshed and sit down beside her. They spoke together, and it was obvious she adored him. It was also obvious that she was a very special lady. I think that all the animals considered that he was one of them, all but a special way. Come to think of it, the humans seem to think more or less the same thing. The amazing thing is not that all the animals came to Bhagavan. It is that we all accepted it and took it for granted without being amazed. Of course, children believe in magic as part of everyday life, but even the grown-ups accepted it as completely natural as far as I can remember. Adam, Franny, and I came to Bhagavan with our toys to show him, with our books and puzzles to share with him, and with our secrets to confide in him. He treated us children with the same courtesy and gave us the same attention that he accorded to the adults with their problems. He also laughed with us. With the passage of time and the realization that he was the great Satguru, people forget in their reverence that Bhagavan had a great sense of humor, and the hall often rang with his laughter. Our lives revolved around Bhagavan and the old hall. We all played on the rocks of Arunachala and made ships or castles out of their shapes, but we gravitated back, and until we were severally sent off to school, the hall was the focus of our lives. Bhagavan sat in one corner with a small revolving bookcase beside him. He kept his favorite works there for easy reference, and he often shared something from one of the shelves with someone who asked him for clarification. That is, if he didn't give his usual reply along the lines of, "First, find out who is asking the question." He did, however, occasionally get involved in points of doctrine. I was in the hall when he was explaining about the spiritual heart on the right side of the body. This surprised me, as I had naturally assumed, as children do, that the heart was on the right side of the body, and couldn't comfortably imagine it anywhere else. Why would that be spoken of as something remarkable? I was in the hall when people sometimes came crying with inner pain. A look from him was often all it took to heal them. It was in the hall that I brought my newspaper folding book. I had received it for my birthday, and one of the designs just would not work out. I tried it again in front of Bhagavan, and of course, this time it worked. I knew it would. People would show him their letters, sometimes from loved ones, and sometimes with news such as job opportunities. We showed him everything, every part of our everyday lives. I wrote to my mother from school and asked at the end of the letter to be remembered to Bhagavan. She showed him the letter, and he said, "If Kitty will remember Bhagavan, then Bhagavan will remember Kitty." Another remark that has given me comfort over the years. We all, humans and animals, came to Bhagavan to show him our triumphs and our troubles, and we knew he would deal with it all and understand it all, often, in fact, usually, without a word being spoken. The long part of the hall at Bhagavan's feet was where people sat as a rule, the men on the left and the women on the right, with a natural passageway in between. Some in silent meditation, some with something to say or to ask, and waiting for the moment that seemed appropriate, and some just sitting there, luxuriating in Bhagavan's presence. Twice a day, morning and evening, the pujaris came and sat up near his couch and chanted the Vedas. First it was a few older men, and then after Chadwick inaugurated the Veda school, there was a leavening of young boys. Although Bhagavan could be friendly and approachable, there were times, usually one of them was when the Vedas were being chanted, when he would close his eyes and go away. To see him then was awe-inspiring. He looked exalted. At times like that, one could hear a pin drop. No one even wanted to breathe too loud. It is strange to reflect on how many moods and faces Bhagavan could wear and belong to none of them. We children accepted it all without question. Bhagavan was Bhagavan, and of course he could do anything and be anyone he chose, naturally. As children, our attitude to Bhagavan was perhaps slightly different from that of the adults. We of course knew that he was God and a wonderful person to be near, truly a magical feeling, but we accepted this quite naturally and without a feeling of awe. However, sometimes even children can be awed. One of those memories I have is rather strange because to this day I recall my amazement and yet nothing actually happened at all. A lady came to Tiruvannamalai from North India. In those days all foreigners, whether they were North Indians or Norwegians, were sent to our home. I was about 10 years old at the time, and not an especially sensitive child, but even I could not bear to stay in the room with her as she was so tense, nervous, and unhappy that it made me most uneasy. Her story was that she had married a man she loved very much, although her parents had not approved as he was of a different caste. However, they had overcome all the opposition, and they went to the seaside somewhere for their honeymoon. They had a week of great happiness until one day he was killed by a shark right in front of her eyes. All this had happened about 2 years earlier, and the distraught widow was traveling through India, going to various ashrams and seeing various holy men. She had a list of questions which she asked each place, all more or less demand why such a thing could happen if there was a God of justice, and so on. She was an unhappy and aggressively angry lady, and my heart sank when my mother asked me to show her the way to the hall where Bhagavan sat. I led in silence, and she followed me. I showed her the hall and went off to play. A while later, I realized it was lunchtime, and I went to collect her and bring her home, most reluctantly. I will never forget the change that had come over her in just an hour. She was calm and relaxed and peaceful and happy. I was so awed and intrigued that I hung around anxiously waiting for my mother to ask her what Bhagavan had said to her. Whatever it was must have been words of the greatest wisdom and power to have such an effect. Eventually my mother did ask, and the lady answered that she had gone into the hall and sat down, and Bhagavan had just looked at her. Just looked. With such infinite compassion that she felt that her questions were of no importance anymore. She sat there and felt the peace, and no word was spoken. Thelma Rappold, an American, had come to India and traveled all over to find a guru. She landed at the Sri Aurobindo ashram in Pondicherry, where she learned about Ramana for the first time. And she was with Ramana during 1947 to 1950, the last few years of his earthly sojourn. This is what she said. On my way to Sri Ramana ashram, when I was in a state of reverie, Sri Ramana appeared to me as a sort of dream. When I actually saw him, it was the same face that I had seen in my reverie. I was really shocked. When I sat in his presence, I felt that my little ego had slipped away. I opened my heart and let those beautiful waves enter into me. It seemed that the so-called problems I thought I had just vanished. I went through a cleansing process. It always amazed me how Sri Ramana sat absolutely quiet and motionless, yet his eyes were so penetrating. When I had questions, I did not verbalize them, because it wasn't necessary. The questions were answered almost immediately. It was our means of communication, a heart-to-heart, mind-to-mind connection. When I first met Sri Ramana, he told me, "You are what you are. Accept it. When the time comes to give it up, do it with grace." As the years went by, I kept trying to open as much as possible. I recognized that we all choose our suffering because we do not open up and accept what life brings.
We don't find out who it is that is experiencing the suffering. I had never, at any previous time in my life, really let go and tried to just be. When we can do this, love just pours out. At the ashram, I had found my true home and teacher. It was as if I had lived several lifetimes in those years that I was with him. The person who came to him in the beginning was not the same person that left. I had understood how to open up the power locked within me.